Check. Check.
Is it live? All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our monthly live stream. Running a little bit last minute today, so if the level's a little off, forgive me for the mic volume. Anyways, today we have the wonderful treat to have very talented pianist and composer, drummer, trumpeter, and amazing educator, the great George Colligan, with us again. George, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah, we're here, by the way, at the Museum of Glass. And we want to thank our sponsors for making this happen. That, of course, is the Museum of Glass, Ted Brown Music, KNKX, Titus Will Cars, Edward Jones Financial Consultant Rick Gray, the Rainier Foundation, and Tacoma Creates. And, of course, you for checking this out, either in real time online or down the road. So we're going to do the interview for about 45 minutes. After that, we'll open things up for questions. So if you have questions for myself or for George, feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll get to them either sooner or later. And today, the reason we have George here is because George, if you read his bio that I posted here, has played with tremendous artists all over the world for decades, and one of which was the great drummer and composer, the great Jack DeJohnette, who recently passed away. And George has worked extensively with Jack, and we're going to be talking about Jack and his legacy and his music today through George's eyes of working with him. So, George, for people that maybe aren't musicians and that don't understand the importance and significance of Jack DeJohnette and his work, can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I would say, it's funny. It reminds me of when I was teaching at the University of Manitoba, and I was trying to explain to some of my classical colleagues, because I was going up for like a first-year evaluation, and they were like, they were saying, they were asking me, so what are some of your creative pursuits, creative work activities? And I said, well, I've been touring with Jack DeJohnette. And they said, well, who is that? And it kind of surprised me that they had never heard of him. But that's fairly common in the classical world. It's sort of a divide between classical and jazz in terms of awareness. Although I feel it more on the classical side of things, like they just don't really consider us. Whereas we know all about what they're doing, or at least more so. Anyway, so I was like, well, and I was trying to think of a way that they could understand. I said, he's like the Yo-Yo Ma of jazz drumming, and they seem to get excited about that, And so is that an accurate assessment? Well, I don't know if it's again, it's more about how important is Jack DeJohnette, or was Jack DeJohnette, for jazz as a whole. I mean, so to me, there's a lot of musicians. I mean, in a way, the history of jazz is about musicians. And, again, you could talk about European classical music being more about composers. And a lot of those composers played, but generally we know them because, especially, pre-20th century, there's no recordings. So we know people through their written music, Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, etc. Whereas we have recordings of musicians from, 20th century. So, in terms of drummers, to me, there's a number of drummers that are really important in terms of how they changed the music and how they influenced everyone else, not just. And I think generally, again, when we're talking about musicians who are important, that's tough. And I've taught jazz history, and a lot of times it's not about, like, you have to decide who's important, but also you have to decide how much time do you have to talk about things. So, like, if you only have one term, 10 weeks, you'll talk about X, Y, and Z. Whereas if you have 3 terms, you can talk about a lot more people, and people who maybe aren't as important will get some time, But in any case, I think Jack DeJohnette was really one of those people that changed the way people thought about drumming and thought about music more than that. So I think anybody who's really considered important and influential is somebody that changes the way, like, plays music in a way approaches music in a way that's so different, that's so unique, and so sort of all-encompassing that it makes people want to not and not just drummers. It makes all musicians think differently. Charlie Parker was one of those people. If you have a jazz history course, you don't talk about Charlie Parker, it's a little suspect, because he's important from that. And you don't have to even like Charlie Parker. You just have to acknowledge. I mean, even Louis Armstrong, like, you know, my guess is that a lot of young jazz musicians aren't sitting around talking about listening to Louis Armstrong records necessarily, but you still have to acknowledge that he was a really important figure, because he changed the way people thought about music, and he was a huge influence not just on trumpeters but on all of music. I mean, in the Ken Burns documentary, Gary Giddens says when you listen to the music of the swing era, it's basically orchestrated Louis Armstrong. So that's pretty significant. Charlie Parker, again, changed the music, you know what I mean? He changed the way people thought about music, and had a lasting influence, not just on saxophone players, but everybody. Everybody needs to study Charlie Parker. So in terms of drummers, and I mean, again, you can have your taste. You know, there might be somebody who's a little more obscure that you're like, that's my favorite drummer. Like Chuck Israel's a great bass player, lives in Portland, talks nonstop about Donald Bailey. That's his guy, because he played with Donald Bailey. So he's like, oh, Donald Bailey was amazing, you know. I mean, I think as a history professor, you wouldn't talk for a whole day about Donald Bailey, just because it's just. Now you could talk about Elvin Jones, you could talk about Tony Williams, you could even talk about Papa Joe Jones, you could talk about Max Roach, of course. I mean, huge impact on the way people thought about how do the drums fit into the music, and how do they make people think about music. So, to me, Jack DeJohnette was like that, and he, for me and for I think so many other musicians, and especially in a way European musicians, a lot of European jazz is really coming out of Jack DeJohnette's approach. I mean, most of the European drummers I've heard and played with, it's like you can sort of see how Jack changed the way they or influenced how they thought about it. So hugely influential, hugely important. Now, what's interesting about Jack DeJohnette is that he started off in Chicago as a pianist. I think he played some organ too, but he was an established pianist, playing gigs and so forth. And I think he kind of just messed with the drums, and he ended up on a gig playing drums with Eddie Harris. and Jack told me himself that Eddie Harris said, I think this is your thing. I think you need to keep playing drums. Because, again, I think he approached it not as a drummer, but as a musician who plays the drums. And honestly, I think that aspect is something that can carry over into all jazz music and music education in general. Is like, don't limit your thinking to your instrument. Don't limit your influences to your instrument. And, you know, again, changing the way people think about music as a whole. So that's what I think Jack brought to it that maybe some other drummers didn't, is that he thought like a pianist who was playing the drums, you know. And I can relate to it because I played drums before I got into piano, but I would say that, I mean, again, my own humble approach is that I try to not think of it just from the standpoint of playing the drums. And I think, again, musicians, when they get together, I'm going down a rabbit hole, I know. I always do this, but like, you know, you want to play what serves the music as a whole. You know what I mean? If you start to get into instrument nerd town, it doesn't work. You know. So to me, Jack served the music, and you know, I think a lot of drummers recognize that. And I mean, he definitely has. There's something in it for drummers too. I mean, he had the chops and all kinds of slick stuff that drummers can really vibe out on. But at the end of the day, it's really all about how he approached the music. And I've heard some drummers who were maybe a little negative, like, oh, he never really got this together, really not. I mean, and I think they missed the point, because lots of things that people play on their instrument have little context. It's all, and in drums especially, there is a context. There has to be a context. Like, you wouldn't go, as great as Jaco Pastorius was, it would be unlikely to go just hear him play solo for 2 hours. Because after a while, you'd be like, be nice if there was some other instruments, you know what I mean? Or, you know what I'm saying? So one time I played at the Montreal Jazz Fest with Lenny White, another great drummer who's still with us, thankfully. But the band before us was a session drummer who, for 45, and this is an audience of all drummers, for 45 minutes just played like digga 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 digga, and of course drummers were like, yeah, and I was like, dude, like it's like there's something missing here, So to me, Jack's ability to tap into what was going on, his ability to listen and interpret was just, and play musical things and have this endless creativity. That's why it's so hard to imitate, even though you could say he has a huge influence, and yet nobody can sound exactly like him, because it's not like he really plays licks the way some people, they have their licks. You always can identify them. I mean, some of my favorite musicians, they have their signature licks that you're like, okay, that's Kenny Kirkland, that's Mulgrew Miller, that's Herbie Hancock, that's Elvin, that type of thing. Here's an Elvin lick, here's a Tony Williams lick. You know what I mean? Jack, it's like he's always had the ability to create new things. To me, it was and I say there's kind of two phases of my relationship with Jack. One was before I got to play with him, and the other was after I got to play with him. So before I got to play with him, I was a huge fan. Some of my favorite records have, just listening to him on record over and over and just being like, wow, like this is some amazing drumming, amazing music. And, me and my drummer friends would talk about Jack DeJohnette all the time. It's like he was just this very important, almost godlike figure. In the same way that Elvin Jones, Tony Williams, and even for me, getting to play with Lenny White was, I listened to him on records, and I was like, I can't even believe I get to play with him. But with Jack, it was kind of funny because I sort of just never expected that I would get to play with him. It's like you hope for these things, but so the way that I ended up, I mean, I think I met Jack somewhere before that, but like the way that I ended up playing with him is kind of a funny story. I had been playing a lot with Don Byron, the clarinetist, and we were playing, I think 4 nights at the Iridium in New York with his big band, the Don Byron Big Band. And I think it was the Friday or Saturday, Don was like, he said, hey, we have this rehearsal with DeJohnette on Sunday at Montana Studios, and Edsel Gomez is in this project. It's a Latin project, and Edsel is not available. Can you sub for him for the rehearsal? I was like, hell yeah, And to me, that was like getting to just be on a rehearsal with Jack DeJohnette, of course, So the Sunday rolls around, and I get to the studio, and it's just Jack. Jack's there setting up his cymbals and crappy drum set. And I'm like, hey, how you doing? And he's like, oh, okay, yeah, subbing for Edsel. So he had a bunch of tunes, and he would play. He didn't have charts, so he would just sit down and play them on the piano. And I was like, okay, so I was like trying to just memorize it real quick. And then we would play. So it's just me and Jack playing, just jamming for an hour. I was like, man, this is incredible. Like, I was like, just felt blessed, you know what I mean? Like, not just to make a rehearsal with Jack, but just to do duo for an hour I was like, this is heavenly, you know what I mean? This is just like the stuff I've been hearing. And plus on crappy drums, I think it were the house cymbals too. and it still sounded amazing. And it was just like, oh, this is it, you know. Then the bass player showed up, Jerome Harris, and then percussionist Luisito showed up. Don spaced. He never showed. He forgot. He drove back up to upstate. So we just rehearsed for a while. And then at the end of the rehearsal, Jack said, yeah, you sound great. I'll keep your number. Now, I mean, if I had a nickel for as many times as people were like, yeah, I'm going to, like, you know what I mean? You at a certain point when you get opportunities, but then there's people who like tease at opportunities, you know, or there's the thought of maybe I'll get to do this, or you might get to do this, or you're like, you know, I'll believe it when I see it, you know what I mean? So I was like, sure, yeah, he'll keep my number, but whatever. I got to rehearse. I could take that to the grave. I got to make a rehearsal with DeJohnette, you know. And then I was leaving my house. I was living in Queens, and I was about to get on the subway, and I see on my phone, about a year later, maybe a year and a half later, I see an 845 number, and I'm like, oh, that's upstate. I wonder who this is. Pick it up, and it's Jack. He's like, hey, man, I'm forming a band, and I want you to play keyboards. It's like, yeah, I kept your number from that rehearsal. I was like, cool, you know. So we and we had this band for a number of years. We didn't have a ton of work, but we had some substantial touring, and we toured the States and Canada and Europe. And it was myself on keyboards and Jerome Harris on bass, who's incredible musician, great vocalist, plays guitar and bass equally well. He played with Jack for a long time. Rudresh Mahanthapa on alto and Dave Fuzinski on guitar. And that was a really fun group. And Jack had written some things for that band. We actually did a recording. It was live at Yoshi's. I think it's hard to find, but we had a good run, and then it kind of fizzled a little bit, and then we were doing some stuff with Don playing saxophone and clarinet and E-flat clarinet, and Marvin Sewell playing guitar. And then we did a tour where it was just trio. Well, sometimes we had Don Byron, but it's basically trio, me, him, and Jerome Harris. And we had, what's his name? Savion Glover, the tap dancer. So it was billed as an evening with Savion Glover and Jack DeJohnette. And so the way those gigs worked, we had a bunch of gigs in the States, and it would be Savion. Sometimes he would bring another dancer, and they would trade off a little bit, but it was oftentimes just Savion. And he would do 45 minutes, 50 minutes, maybe even an hour. Then we would play some trio, and when we would play trio, sometimes Jack would play piano and I would play drums, or he would play piano and I would play trumpet, pocket trumpet. This is his idea. I didn't ask it.
No one's judging. No one's
he
judging.
would say, like, bring the pocket trumpet. I'd be like, all right. So, and then at the end, we would kind of jam it out all together, you know. It was amazing to watch Savion. Savion I mean, I was joking with him one time. Savion was very quiet, but I was joking with him. I was like, man, the military needs to study your blood, because it just, his endurance, I mean, his inventiveness, I mean, he's, again, totally unique as a tap dancer, you know. I mean, he takes that tradition, which is sort of tied into jazz, but he had his own take on it. And he would quote tunes, and really knowledgeable in terms of the music, you know. But yeah, just witnessing that was like, holy crap, you know. He'd be dripping with sweat. It was amazing. And then getting to play with him was really unbelievable. So yeah, and then after that, I guess, you know, Jack was doing this thing for a while. He had the Hudson group, which was John Medeski and who else? Larry Grenadier and Scofield. And then he had a group with Ravi Coltrane and Matt Garrison. And I think it wasn't too long after that, I mean, and then there was COVID, of course, but then I think he decided that he didn't really want to travel too much and tour too much, and He had, I mean, to be quite honest, I always felt like Jack seemed like a bit of a hypochondriac, like, because he always seemed really healthy to me, like, never had a weight issue, never had a substance issue, and seemed very energetic, like, always very, like, you know, and I was playing with him, he was in his, I guess he would have been in his late 60s, early 70s, and, there was one, he would always say stuff like, oh, I don't want to, you know, play too hard, you know. But then as soon as we started playing, he would really kick butt, you know, and he just couldn't help himself, you know. And at one point he was like, we were about to go out on stage in Cambridge in the UK, and he made some kind of comment like, I remember his wife was standing there too, and he said, oh, we should try to play more tunes. So let's try to take shorter solos so we can play more tunes. And I was like, well, you're going to have to play worse. And I think at first he didn't understand what I meant, but I was like, if it feels so good to play with you that we can't stop, you know what I mean? Like that was the beauty of his playing, is it just, his feel was so incredible that you could just play for that. To me is like, when it's right, you just never want it to stop, you know what I mean? I have a similar feeling when I play with Buster Williams and Lenny White, like the rhythm section feel. I mean, this is something I talk about a lot in teaching, and although it's very abstract, it's like developing a feel, you know, might be one of the hardest things, but if you can do it, if you can figure out how to have a good, and that goes for any instrument, especially rhythm section, you know, but just in general, if the feel is good, and that really has a lot to do with rhythm, but if the feel is good, then that trumps everything, you know what I mean? It takes precedence, you know. So you could be playing all the right notes, you could know all the tunes, you could, you know, whatever, but like if the feel is not right, you know, it doesn't have that sense of like, oh, this could just go on forever, you know what I mean? And so that to me is playing with Jack again. It's like you could take chorus after chorus, and not to plug my latest album, but I put out a record. So again, we're going on tangents, but we'll figure out a way to make it all related. But so my latest album is called Live at the Jazz Standard, and it's with Jack DeJohnette and a bass player named Linda O. Larry Grenadier did a record with us about it. It was supposed to be basically a record release for the one that I did called The Endless Mysteries on Origin with Jack and Larry Grenadier. And Larry couldn't make it. It was a little mysterious, but he said he couldn't make it, so I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether, maybe he didn't want to make it. I don't know, but like he couldn't make it. So at the time, I had really been enjoying playing with a bass player named Linda O, who now she's very much established. But at the time, I think she was really gung-ho about playing with Jack. I was like, yeah, can you make this gig? And she's like, yeah. So we did one night at the Jazz Standard and played music from that album, and just an incredible night. And I mean, if anybody played their butt off, it was Linda. Linda sounded amazing. She was just like, and so I always sort of regretted that we were never able to repeat that, you know. But just as it happens, cut to 2021. So that gig was I want to say 2014, and cut to 2021. I'm sitting in a hotel in Brooklyn. I had gotten COVID in New York. I was in New York for 10 days, and the last day I was there, I got COVID, and it was the Omicron. And so I was supposed to play at Smalls that night, and I missed the gig. And I was like, well, I'm supposed to quarantine. So during my quarantine, sitting in this hotel, I was just, you know, going through my computer, and I found a tape or a recording of that gig, and I was listening to it, and I was like, I got to put this out somehow. The mix was strange. It was like very bass heavy, and I was like, I wasn't even sure if there was the technology to fix that. and sure enough, there is the technology for that. So I found a mastering engineer named Dana White who he was like, oh yeah, this is easy, just so he fixed that, and then I put it out on the Whirlwind Recordings label, and again, just the interplay is I mean, Linda sounds amazing. It's just and I really regretted that we never were able to do that again. It was just basically a one night only. So earlier this year, this was back in like January, I called Jack because I was like, oh, maybe I could convince him to do some kind of record release gig in New York, because he had said that he wasn't really into traveling or playing a whole lot, and I was like, come on, just one night, So I called him and I said, yeah, would you be willing to do like one CD release gig, just for old time's sake? And he said, well, I'm retired, I'm not, and I haven't been playing a whole lot. And he's like, for something like that, you might want to get Nasheet Waits. And I was like, what? Like, that's not, I mean, but, and he said, well, I know he's not me. I'm like, precisely. He's not you. It's no point. That would be something totally different. You know what I mean? So, and I don't know. He just didn't seem to be, I think we talked about space heaters after that, and that's the last time I talked to him. And I didn't know that he was, because I guess what happened in the interim was he had fallen, because he had some little, what I considered to be sort of minor health things, and because when people get into their 80s, everybody's got a health thing when they're in their 80s, something, but he had fallen, and I guess it was it had some complications, and so tragically about a month ago, maybe more than a month now, I got a message from Terry Lynn Carrington that was like, oh, I just want to let you know that Jack is not going to make it. He's in organ failure. And I was like, what? Like, I just, it's totally out of the blue. I just had no idea. I mean, again, because he always seemed really healthy to me, I just didn't conceive that he would go like that, So, I mean, it was heartbreaking because, and again, this is, when you, I mean, again, I considered him like more than a celebrity. It was like a god of the music, you know what I mean? And sometimes you get to meet and interact with some great people. I mean, I've been really lucky, but he especially was really, that was, so I'm sort of backtracking, but I'll come back to what I was going to say, is that for me, getting to play with Jack DeJohnette was very significant for me. It was sort of like, from a career standpoint, it was symbolic. It was sort of like, okay, like everything I've been doing is paying off musically, I didn't get into another tax bracket, but, well, that was really only because I was teaching, but in terms of playing, getting to play with somebody who was that amazing and that important to me previously was like it's like a dream come true, literally a dream come true, you know what I mean? And so, but sometimes, I'll say this, sometimes there's people that you idolize, that you listen to on records, and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing, and then you meet them and you play with them, you're like, oh, this is not what I thought, that can definitely happen, or they're
Yes.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. So that's the thing, is you never really know. But what it was, in a way, getting to play with him was even more special than I thought it would be, because it just changed the way I thought about everything. I mean, really just the whole, I mean, almost, and in a way about life, but definitely about how to think about music on a broad scale, you know what I mean? Because again, that endless creativity, that fearlessness, The first gig we did was right after my oldest son was born, and it's kind of funny because my my mother-in-law didn't want me to go because we were in Winnipeg, and we didn't really have any family in Winnipeg, and my wife was alone with the kid, with the baby. And also Winnipeg is kind of a horrible place.
You've described it in other interviews.
Yeah, it's super cold, and so, but I said, look, I get it, but I've been waiting a lifetime to do this, so I can't give it up, you know. I'd actually canceled a gig with Tom Harrell because I thought, you know, that's around the time my son was going to be born, and I had it on the books a year out. We were supposed to play in Russia, and I told Tom's wife, I said, I think my son is going to be born around that time, so I'm going to have to cancel. They never called me again. So, you know, it's hard to balance, as you know. Your kids are back there, you know. But so anyway, so when we did the week at Birdland, I just remember thinking a couple things. It was like I felt like I was like, how am I going to make this work? Because I didn't want to be nervous. I wanted to enjoy it, and I wanted to experience it. And I was like, I'm just going to pretend that I'm in the audience, and I have a really good seat. And so in that sense, I'm just going to listen. I told myself the key is to listen as hard as you can. And so that, I mean, because I think that's really what Jack did, is he just listened like crazy, you know. And I believe that listening in music, I know it sounds funny because we think listen to music, but I honestly think that when people play, they're not often listening. They're playing and they're thinking about, how do I sound? Rather than like, how does the whole thing sound? And what are other people doing? And how am I communicating? So that's what I tried to do. And I also thought to myself, because the way Jack played and the way it made me feel when I played, it sort of made me almost want to make the Keith Jarrett noises. So I said to myself, that's why Keith makes those noises. It's not because he's crazy. It's because playing with Jack makes you feel like, you know, channeling your inner gremlin. You know what I mean? So anyway, so yeah, it was just, it made me, and here's the other thing too, is that when I was in Winnipeg teaching, they had a drum teacher who will remain nameless. It's not his fault. I get it. He didn't want to live in Winnipeg. But he quit like right before I moved there. And so when I got there, they said, you're going to have 8 drum students. I was like, well, I've never taught a drum lesson. And they're like, well, we don't have anybody else. So I was like, what do I teach the drummers, you know? So I was like, okay, well, let's work on the rudiment ritual, the Alan Dawson rudiment ritual. And we worked on that, and none of them could play it. It was, you know, it was rough. But so we were working on that, and then after a semester of that, then I did that gig with DeJohnette at Birdland, and it was so not that. Like Jack's approach, even though he knows rudiments, but it was so musical. It was so like sort of beyond drumming that I was like, I felt like, well, now I have to totally, I was like, how can I get the drummers to play like this rather than just a rudimental approach? I mean, and again, the key is the music, you know, which is what they had a hard time with, is because again, they were all thinking like drummers. They're not thinking like musicians, you know. And I'm not even making a joke that, you know, a drummer is somebody who hangs out with musicians, because it can be the same of any instrument. You get piano nerds and saxophone nerds, and you know, and they just nerd out on their instrument rather than what is the larger context. So to me, that was his. He's not the only one, but for me, that was really representative of that. So again, cut back to when I heard that Jack was not long for this world. It was overwhelming because, I mean, again, we talked about the music, but as a person too, he was just super cool. I mean, I stayed at his house a number of times and got to know him and his wife, and he treated me almost like a son. You know, there was one time I stayed at his house, and Jack was like, he was like, oh, me and Lydia thought you might want to stay some extra time because we kind of like having you around. You know what I mean? And that was really touching. You know, one time I stayed there, and it was my birthday, December 29th, and when I woke up, Jack and I got a picture of it, but I wish I had gotten a film of it. But Jack played on his piano and sang Happy Birthday. He sang Happy Birthday, but played piano in the style of McCoy Tyner. It was unbelievable. I mean, he was you know, again, the way he thought about things was really quite amazing, you know. And so when I heard the news, I was like, oh, I mean, it was just really, it was really sad. And so I wrote it. I was like, you know, I mean, this is the thing. There's certain times in life where you just feel kind of helpless, you know, but you want to do something. So I wrote a piece called "Song for Jack DeJohnette," and I made a little recording of it, and I sent it to his wife, and she played it for him before he passed, and he acknowledged that he heard it, you know. And again, I don't know. I mean, if somebody did that for me when I'm on my deathbed, I don't know whether I'd have the consciousness to be like, you know, like, oh, cool tune. You know what I mean? It's not helping.
Turn it off.
Yeah, right. Oh, that sucks. You're killing me here, you know. But you know, anyway, I you know, so he was really more than just a musical figure. I mean, he was somebody really significant in my life, and like anything, you wish you could appreciate it more. If I had known he was gonna, but again, I thought he'd make it to his 90s. I was like, there's no way he's not making it to his 90s, because, and we had played a concert up in Kingston 2 years prior. We had this blowout concert. It was like it was a tribute to Miles, but it was really for Jack. It was like his birthday. You know, it was in August of, I want to say 2023, and it's a whole bunch of Santana was there. That was interesting. Santana and Cindy Blackman and all the members of Living Colour and Don Byron and Wallace Roney Jr. and Luisito on percussion, and it was a lot of people on stage. It was like a Parliament Funkadelic concert, you know. And it was just great. It was super great. And Jack sounded great. And again, we got to, you know, I stayed at his house, and you know, we got to play music, and he seemed fine. He seemed totally fine then. So in fact, I had, you know, it was like, how much synthesizer stuff did I want to do? So I had a little MIDI keyboard about this big, but Jack has this Korg. I want to say it's a Kronos, like Korg Kronos, and I was like, we should probably use this for the gig. And so I was like, can we get somebody to move it, like take it from, because he had this, they have this really wonderful house it's way up in Willow, New York. You gotta basically climb a mountain to get there. It's like super, I mean, they were there for almost 50 years, I think. And he had this kind of music area in the basement, but it's like they probably added it after the fact, so it's like this like ladder almost that you got to go down, you know. And then he's got his drums and tons of cymbals and keyboards also. So I was like, for the concert, can you have somebody come and bring the keyboard? He was like, oh no, we can get it, we can move it. So he, you know, and I guess he was 81 at the time. He and I moved this heavy, it's not light like this keyboard, it was heavy keyboard. We both moved it up those stairs. And so I'm like, he seems healthy as a horse to me. So like, I was pretty impressed, you know. So it's all the more surprising that he passed so suddenly. So
You've already mentioned a lot of things, just your observations and being around Jack and his sphere of influence, things that you were able to take away and inform your playing. Aside from that, just in the time that you spent with him and conversations that you had, did you guys ever, I mean, I'm sure you must have discussed music. Did you learn are there any other things that you maybe takeaways from being around him and his influence that you've used for your own playing, aside from just observing him and the listening and the creativity aspects that you mentioned?
well, trying to think, because I would say that one of the things I took away was just to be more broad-minded than most jazz musicians end up being. I understand the tendency to go into jazz snobbery, like you know, it's sort of like my best friend is a bassist named David Efros, and he talks about when he became a jazz snob, because when I met him, he was into, you know, the Rolling Stones and, you know, a lot of pop music and that type of thing, and playing, you know, songs from his camp or whatever, you know. And when he finally got the jazz bug, he said that he took all his rock records in a box. I mean, this is the 80s, you know. He took all his rock records and either gave them away or sold them to some consignment store. He was just like, I'm done with this. I'm into jazz now. And I think it's normal to go through that, like sort of like, okay, I'm only going to listen to jazz, you know. And so he, in fact, when I was up there the last time talking to him and his wife Lydia, they were talking about how Terry Lynn Carrington, who was again a really good friend of theirs, was definitely like a jazz bebop, just into bebop, you know. and Jack was like, you really gotta be broader than that, because all of these things in music can influence you, you know what I mean? And it all works to make you being a well-rounded, in terms of your awareness of different types of things, will just make you a stronger musician, you know what I mean? And again, when you look at Charlie Parker, he loved opera, he loved country music, anything that was musical. He just was like, how can I use this, you know what I mean? He loved Stravinsky, you know what I mean? So if you just, you know, you can't be too narrow, you know, you cut yourself off from possibilities, you know. So
I know we're getting kind of short on time here, and again, our apologies for starting a little bit late. At this time, if you have questions for George or myself, let us know. Are there any questions? Any questions? Yes, you, sir. Yes.
yes. Yes.
So the question is for people that can't hear, that you were mentioning earlier, when you play with a group, it's more important to listen to the collective, if I'm saying this right, as opposed to just listening to yourself. Am I getting this correct? Yeah. So
Yes.
Music is far more collective than individualistic. So the question
Yes,
is, rhythm is more important than
well,
basic melody.
Yes. I mean, in a perfect world, you do everything right. But if you could, let's put it this way, if you prioritize notes and everything else and you don't develop a good sense of rhythm, that would be suboptimal. Whereas if you have a really good sense of rhythm and maybe notes aren't always 100%, I think you would have more success. Again, we're just talking about like if in an imperfect world where you can't do everything. But I think what happens in music education is that we prioritize notes because it's very tangible, especially if you're reading music. You know, it's like, these are the notes on the page, you didn't play them. Here's what Beethoven wrote, you didn't play that. It's wrong. Go back. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? But like in jazz though, developing a feel, like for example, you could have a bass player who maybe is a little fuzzy on the changes sometimes, or he may not even know the song at all, but if he has a great feel, that could be better. That would be better. You know what I mean? And in a way, I would rather have a bass player that knows how to make it feel good than a bass player who's like, okay, I know, you know, I have all these notes that I know. You know what I mean? Or I'm playing it exactly right. But if the feel isn't right, and again, feel is intangible because it's something that's, it's hard to write it down. You know, in fact, that's the problem with written solos. Like, I'll give you an example. There was a student at Portland State where I teach, Portland State University. It's in Oregon. Yeah. Portland is not a state. So why is it called Portland State? So, but I had a student who came into his jury and he read Lee Morgan's solo on Ciora. He read it and he mostly played the notes really well. But the problem is he read a transcription that somebody else did, and he wasn't playing along with the record. So there's rhythmic things that are not quantifiable in the Western European notation. So, like, the easiest rhythms to read are the ones that are very, divisible. You know what I mean? You have your quarter notes, you have your triplets, you have your eighth notes, you have your 16th notes. So, if your quarter note is here, da 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 da, like those are all mathematically agreed upon. But the solo was played by a human being who was playing stuff that was in between that. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, if you had a phrase in English or in any language and you had 5 different people from different parts of the world read it, it would sound totally different. You know what I mean? But it's hard to put that on the page. You know what I mean? So to me, it's the dialect of jazz, the human quality, the organic quality, the actual sound of it. So my point is, with this Lee Morgan solo, he totally missed that. And it was, as great as that solo is played by Lee Morgan, this student, it was like, it would be like if I said, if I was trying to read French and I didn't know, I'd be like, Je voudrais de l'eau, si vous plate, si vous plate. It'd be like, no, just don't even try. You know what I mean? You've
I understand. I do it.
And they just look at you like, please stop. Arrête, s'il vous plaît. You know what I mean? So, you know what I'm saying? Like, it was the opposite. And I just said, like, look, you need to listen to this solo and hear how what was written as eighth notes is actually not eighth notes. It's actually something in between that. Because otherwise you lose the character. So that's what I'm saying, is like the feeling of jazz is deeper than just what can be written by Western notation. You know what I mean? Even just the swing rhythm, the swing beat. Now that our drummer's here, he could chime in. But like, the swing beat, there's lots of interpretations of it. Like, how do you write it in Western notation? It's a quarter note, eighth note in triplets, or it's, people have different ways of explaining it. But to me, I'm like, well, this is how Tony Williams plays a skip beat. This is how Elvin Jones plays a skip beat. This is how Bill Stewart plays a skip beat. This is how it's every drummer, Ben Riley, Jack DeJohnette, Dave Weckl, whoever it is, they all have a way of playing the skip beat that's unique. And so everybody swings in a unique way, but it's still good. You know what I mean? So again, it's like, when you're studying a language, you could work on it in a class and read it and understand the rules, but if you don't get that organic quality, and my Spanish is really bad now because I haven't been to Spain in so long, but when I was going to Spain, that was the best crash course in Spanish. I never took Spanish in school, but I went to Spain, I was forced, and I was hearing it all the time. So to me, that was the best way to really get the truth of it, rather than like, oh, just study the Berlitz book and, You know what I'm saying? So that's what I meant. Do you play? What do you play? Okay, cool, yeah. So that's the thing that we need to be listening for is the feel, you know. There's a guitar player named Bobby Broom who lives in Chicago, who I'm dying to play with him. And I don't know if he would want to play with me, but like his feel is unbelievable. I mean, he has good notes too, but the rhythmic feel is just, it's incredible. It's like I would rather listen to him than many jazz trios with piano. You know, I'd rather listen to a guitar trio with Bobby Broom than some piano trios. You know what I mean? It's just so, it's because of the feel. It just, and I know, and that can mean like it makes you feel something, but we talk about the rhythm, the way he puts his eighth notes and the way he phrases things. To me, that's something I think I've always been attracted to. And that's kind of the thing that was going for me when I started as a pianist, because I was a trumpeter. He hasn't seen all the other interviews, but I've talked about this before. I was a classical trumpet player. I was playing drums a little bit, and then I sort of discovered piano. But the reason that I started getting piano gigs, I think, off the bat is because I had listened to a lot of records and had that kind of, it felt like jazz. I only knew a couple songs and a few voicings, you know, as you'll find out later when we play. But like, you know what I'm saying? It's like, the people are like, oh, it sounds like jazz, so we need you for a gig, you know. That's what I'm saying. Like, again, a bass player who, if it feels good, they don't have to know all the tunes. You want them to know all the tunes. You know, you gotta know stuff, but at the same time, like, if the feel is, and same with drums, piano, anything, it's like the feel has to be, because it's kind of like there's some musicians that, for me, they fall in the category of like, they're great, but I don't want to listen to them, or I don't want to hear it, you know. And there's some works of art like that. Like, there's some movies where you could acknowledge this is a great movie, but I just don't, it doesn't do anything for me. You know what I mean? Or there could be some great painting, you know, or there's some great pop music that I'm not going to say it's terrible music. I'm just going to say it doesn't do anything for me, you know. Right. It's like Taylor Swift, you know. I don't know any of his songs, you know.
I was just seeing if my daughter was listening, but all right. Well, we're close to the time here. Are there any other questions before we? Oh, we do have another question. Yes. Practice question. Yes.
What do you play? What's your instrument? Okay.
So the question is, with a limited amount of time, how do you know what to prioritize when you're practicing?
Well, I could talk about this for a while, but there's a great saxophonist named Miguel Zenon. He won one of those Genius Grants a while ago. He's Puerto Rican. And he gave me this little thing that was like, I forget where he said he got it from, but it was like, let's say that you have, because the point is consistency and to have some things that you're working on a regular basis, right? So let's suppose that you have a day where you have 6 hours and you have 6 things you're working on. You could try to spend an hour on each of those things. If you only have 6 minutes, spend 1 minute on each of those things. So I always preach, this is just from a time management standpoint, because again, the key is consistency. So I would rather students play a little bit every day than try to cram for the test. It's like if your goal is to run a marathon and you're like you do nothing until the day before. You're like, oh, I think I'll do a 20-mile run today. That's not going to work. So the point is thinking long term and thinking, and again, even 10 minutes, even 5 minutes, even just, for me, I have kids, I have all kinds of stuff going on. I try to get a few minutes a day of just getting to an instrument, you know what I mean? Now, in terms of technical things versus music, you always want to keep in mind what your ultimate goal is. So if your goal is to play music in the way it's supposed to be played, just keep that in mind, because technique means different things to different people, and I think some people go down the road of technique and it goes into instrumental nerdville, which is like, oh, look what I can do, rather than like, I'll give you an example with trumpet. This is one reason I don't play trumpet anymore. You could after this do a search on YouTube for trumpet high notes. Do like trumpet triple G or double G, and a lot of stuff will come up. There'll be like, Jimmy whoever from Des Moines, Iowa, playing a double high G for 10 seconds. You're like, what are you doing with your life? You know what I mean? Whereas other instruments, here's a song that I learned. Here's a song that I wrote. Whereas trumpet players are like, look at how high I can play. Isn't that amazing? It's like, yeah, great. The tea's ready. The kettle is ready. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm saying, is like technique just becomes like you go down that road and then you're like, wait, I forgot to learn music. And that was the thing about Jack, is that, Jack DeJohnette, was that he had technique, but he used it in a way that was musically relevant, contextual, and unique. Whereas a lot of drummers, they're like, look at all this stuff I can do. And it's like, yeah, but how does that fit into the music? You know what I mean? So there's lots of drum videos, people who, and they have these huge drum sets, 15 toms and 50 cymbals, and you're like, yeah, but can you swing? You know what I mean? Or do you even know any of the tunes? So that type of thing.
All right. Well, we need to draw things to a close. Thank you to everybody who joined us here in person and online. And if we didn't get to your questions now, we can go back later and do our best to get to them at another time. But thank you for joining us. And George, thank you for giving us your words of wisdom yet again.
Always my pleasure, Kareem.
We're going to take a short break, and then we'll get things reconfigured and play some music for you. So join us, and thanks for watching.